This program is supported by SMC Global Power.
Hello, I'm Alma Angeles and you're watching Eagle News International. Good evening, CJ.
Good evening, Alma, and welcome to the program. Here are tonight's headlines.
The Department of Labor and Employment, or DOLE, said it will issue the guidelines in connection with a new directive of the IATF regarding coming days on the mandatory vaccination for on-site workers.
We are not
A draft
there yet.
statement of the COP26 summit called on nations to ease their reliance on fossil fuels as talks entered their final hours without any sign of delivering the emissions cuts needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
A 5.2 magnitude earthquake rocked southern Iceland near the Hekla volcano, with tremors felt in the capital Reykjavik, some 110 kilometers away.
Thanks, Kathy.
And a SpaceX capsule carrying 4 astronauts docked with the International Space Station, kicking off a 6-month stay on the orbiting outpost.
We could have imagined. And
First, the Department of Labor and Employment, or DOLE, on Friday said it will issue the guidelines in connection with a new directive of the Interagency Task Force for the Management of Emerging Infectious Diseases. In the coming days, DOLE spokesperson Rolly Francia is certain that the necessary order is currently being prepared. What this is, let's listen in.
So, I'm sure in the by next week, probably meron ng action ng department yan. Pero dahil kakalabas pa lang niya kanina, so I'm sure the appropriate focal or agency involved in crafting that is already preparing the necessary either advisory or
Now, today, Malacanang announced that public and private sector employees who will report to work on site are required to be vaccinated starting next month. Covered by this new directive are eligible workers in areas where there are sufficient supplies of COVID vaccines. Employees that are unvaccinated have to undergo regular RT-PCR or reverse transcription polymerase chain reaction testing or antigen test to be shouldered by them.
Health Undersecretary Maria Rosario Vergeira said no COVID-19 vaccine manufacturer has applied for emergency use authorization for the safe administration of their jabs to children ages 5 to 11 years old. Take a look.
Hanggang sa ngayon po, wala pa hong manufacturer that has already applied for an EUA for the 5 to 11 years old. Ang sabi po ng Food and Drug Administration, they are expecting submission already from Pfizer kasi dun sa US FDA na aprubahan na siya. And usually daw, apparently, according to FDA, kapag nakakakuha na ng emergency use authority sa US, ang manufacturers ay agad-agad na nagsusumite sa iba't ibang bansa ng kanilang application for this specific age group. So aantayin natin na mag-apply sila and then we will wait for the evaluation and the issuance of EUA from the Food and Drug Administration.
To date, only children aged 12 to 17 years old are included in the government's vaccination program, where they are given Pfizer and Moderna jabs.
And staying in the country, the Department of Education said it will increase the number of participating schools in the pilot implementation of face-to-face or F2F classes following the approval of the Office of the President. In a statement, the DepEd reported there are more schools qualified to be included in the pilot list based on the assessment it has conducted together with the Department of Health. From the latest transmittal of DOH, 484 out of the 638 passed their granular risk assessment as minimal or low risk. They have also received several appeals from LGUs, including NCR, to have their schools and their jurisdiction selected in the pilot implementation, according to them. The DepEd noted additional schools will be evaluated based on readiness and DOH's assessment of their COVID risk level. The 100 public schools which were identified by DepEd on Wednesday will proceed with their pilot face-to-face classes on November 15.
A health official warned the public against getting unauthorized booster shots, saying the government cannot be held accountable for any untoward reactions it may bring. In an online media forum, Health Undersecretary Maria Rosario Vergera said the Department of Health is aware of reports about people receiving booster shots despite the absence of emergency use authorization for such jabs.
Ngayon, Aiko, we had been hearing a lot of reports, kaliwat kanan, nagpapa-booster doses ang ating mga kababayan. Unang-una, kailangan maintindihan nyo, wala pong emergency use authority ang ginagamit nyo ng mga bakuna. Pagka nagkaroon po ng, wag naman sana, aberya o kaya untoward reactions to these booster doses, government cannot be held accountable. The ones accountable will be the ones who gave you those vaccines and who have sourced out these vaccines. Pangalawa, you are violating national protocols kung saan ang boosters hindi pa ho kasama sa ating mga guidelines and protocols. So just to remind everybody to wait for this emergency use authority or the guidelines from national government. Hindi po ito para i-restrict kayo, hindi po para i-control ang paglabas nito mga bakuna para sa mga ganitong gawain, ngunit para masiguro po ng gobyerno na ito po ay magiging ligtas at magiging effective para po sa ating mga kababayan.
Germany needs further coronavirus restrictions to combat a record surge in infection and get through this winter, that according to the country's likely next leader, Olaf Scholz, calling a national meeting to decide new curbs. Let's listen in.
Genau diese Damen und Herren, das Virus ist noch unter uns und bedroht die Gesundheit der Bürgerinnen und Bürger. Und deshalb ist es ganz, ganz wichtig, dass wir alle Maßnahmen ergreifen, um sicher zu sein, dass wir die Gesundheit der Bürgerinnen und Bürger unseres Landes schützen können. Auch wenn die Lage anders ist, weil so viele geimpft sind, ist sie noch nicht gut. Ganz besonders deshalb, weil nicht genügend Bürgerinnen und Bürger von der Impfmöglichkeit bisher Gebrauch gemacht haben. Und deshalb müssen wir weiter vorsichtig sein.
The EU's most populous country recorded 50,196 new cases in the past 24 hours. According to the Robert Koch Institute Health Agency, the first time the figure has exceeded 50,000. Infections and deaths have been climbing steeply since mid-October in an outbreak blamed on Germany's relatively low vaccination rate of just over 67%. After getting through the first three onslaughts of the pandemic better than many of its neighbors, the current fourth wave seemed to take the nation by surprise. At nearly 250 infections per 100,000 people, Germany is faring much worse than France, Italy, or Spain, according to the Statista data agency.
Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte will on Friday announce new COVID-19 restrictions, reportedly including Western Europe's first partial lockdown of the winter as cases hit record levels. The 3 weeks of measures are planned, with bars, restaurants, and non-essential shops having to close at 7 p.m. and people again advised to work from home, according to local media. Public events will be scrapped, while football matches, including the Netherlands Home World Cup qualifier with Norway next week, must be played behind closed doors. Schools will, however, reportedly remain open, and people will be allowed to leave their homes without restrictions. Now, the Netherlands on Thursday reported 16,364 new cases over the previous 24 hours, smashing the previous record of 12,997 set last December. Hospitals have warned they will not be able to make it through the winter under the current conditions. The COVID spike comes despite the fact that 82% of Dutch people over the age of 12 have been fully vaccinated.
An Australian medical tech manufacturer has recalled more than 2 million at-home COVID tests shipped to the United States after finding an increased chance of false positives. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration issued an alert Wednesday that the company Ellume had recalled 2.2 million tests since the issue was detected last month. A false positive test result indicates that a person has coronavirus when they do not. The FDA has identified this as a Class 1 recall, the most serious type of recall, according to the agency in a notice. Use of these tests may cause serious adverse health consequences or death. The FDA said it had received 35 reports of false positives and no deaths to date. In early October, Ellume announced a voluntary recall of 195,000 tests after false positive results were reported in some product batches at higher than expected rates.
Hundreds of Croatians protested on Thursday for the fourth day in Zagreb and other cities against obligatory certificates for the public sector as the country's COVID-19 cases hit a record high. Earlier this month, the authorities introduced more restrictive measures to fight the record surge of coronavirus infections since the start of the pandemic, with some of Europe's lowest inoculation rates. Starting on Monday, all public sector employees and people visiting public institutions will need certificates. So far, the measure was obligatory for health and social welfare sectors only. On Wednesday, Croatia recorded its highest number of daily infections, with 7,315 people testing positive in 24 hours. Just around 45% of the country's 4.2 million people have been fully vaccinated, according to AFP data.
And to Africa now, where the UN Health Agency has said that diabetics are 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than those who do not have the disease. The alert from the World Health Organization, WHO, follows analysis of 13 African countries where there was a more than 10% fatality rate among patients with diabetes and the coronavirus, compared with 2.5% for COVID-19 patients overall. Diabetes impairs our ability to produce or process insulin, which is needed to prevent a dangerous rise in blood sugar. The disease causes inflammation and poor blood circulation, which increases the risk of complications, including death from COVID-19. An estimated 24 million people live with diabetes in Africa today, and this number is expected to nearly double by 2045. Africa is also the region with the highest number of people who do not know their diabetic status, with an estimated 7 in 10 not knowing if they have the disease.
British Health Secretary Sajid Javid tells the UK Parliament that all NHS England staff will be required to have the COVID-19 vaccine by spring 2022. An estimated 80,000 to 100,000 staff who are currently working within the NHS have not been vaccinated. We have Kathleen Eusebio reporting.
Here is an update in the United Kingdom. All frontline workers in the National Health Service in England will need to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 from April 1 or lose their jobs, Health Minister Sajid Javid said on Tuesday. The government had already announced that all care home workers will need to have had both jabs from November 11, but was waiting on the findings of a consultation before extending it to all NHS frontline staff.
There will be 2 key exemptions. One for those who don't have face-to-face contact with patients, and the second for those that are medically exempt. These requirements will apply across health and wider social care settings that are regulated by the Care Quality Commission. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this decision doesn't mean that I don't recognise concerns about workforce pressures this winter and indeed beyond, as a result of some people perhaps choosing to leave their job because of the decision that we've taken. Of course, I recognise that. It's with this in mind that we've chosen for the condition not to come into force until 12 weeks after parliamentary approval, that no one in the NHS or care that is currently unvaccinated should be scapegoated, singled out or shamed. That would be totally unacceptable. This is about supporting them to make a positive choice, to protect vulnerable people, to protect their colleagues, and of course, to protect themselves.
The move comes at a time when the publicly funded health service is already facing a huge waiting list due to a dramatic reduction in appointments during the pandemic. The NHS, which is funded from general taxation and national insurance contributions, is Europe's biggest employer and one of the biggest in the world, with some 1.3 million staff. Jarvis stated around 90% of NHS staff have received at least 2 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine, although the figure is closer to 80% in some areas. This means there are up to 100,000 NHS workers in England who are unvaccinated, raising fears about how the service will cope if they lose their jobs. According to Labour's health spokesman Jonathan Ashworth, the NHS is under the most intense pressure this winter already, and the waiting list are at close to 6 million. Nursing union officer Stuart Tuckwood, meanwhile, warned that adopting this compulsory approach could actually demoralize staff and could force them to leave the health service at a time when they're very much struggling with staffing members.
But we don't think that compelling staff to have it, adopting this mandatory vaccination policy, is the right approach. We still think that there's work to be done in terms of having conversations with people who've not had the vaccine yet, making sure we understand their reasons for doing so, making sure that it's fully accessible to them to do that. And we're very worried that adopting this compulsory approach could actually demoralise staff, could force them to leave the health service at a time when we're very, very much struggling with staffing numbers in the NHS. And so we'd like to see the government take a different approach. So we're quite frustrated by the announcement today. The NHS is really constantly on a knife edge at the moment in terms of staffing levels. Very, very much struggled during the pandemic and before that because of 11 years of underfunding and austerity. And it really doesn't take much to push the health service into crisis at the moment. And it really, what we're seeing from the adoption of this policy in the care sector is that it has led to worsening staff shortages. And so we're very anxious to make sure that that doesn't happen in the health service as well. So we do have some time before this policy is potentially implemented. So we want to see the government make sure that all resources are put towards talking to people, having conversations, supporting them to make sure that we can try and persuade as many of those people to have their vaccines as possible.
Ministers have so far resisted calls to impose general vaccine requirements in enclosed public spaces, and although daily case levels have fallen over recent days, the 7-day average is still nearly 37,500. Health policy is controlled by the devolved administrations in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Scotland and Wales have already indicated they have no plans to make jabs compulsory for healthcare workers. Northern Ireland is consulting on the issue. Reporting from London, United Kingdom, I'm Kathleen Eusebio. We live in interesting times.
Thank you, Kathleen. Meanwhile, Norway will reintroduce nationwide measures to stem surging coronavirus cases, including authorizing towns to use health passes, according to the government announcing it today. The Nordic country, which had lifted all COVID-19 restrictions in late September, will also propose a third vaccine dose for people over 18, but will not impose a new lockdown. Prime Minister Jonas Gahr told a press conference. The new measures include a requirement for adults who have been in contact with a positive case to be tested, and unvaccinated health workers will have to be tested twice a week and wear masks. Europe is facing a sharp deterioration in the epidemic situation, especially in Germany and Central and Eastern Europe. Non-vaccinated people are the most affected.
The Philippines has put the Netherlands and Faroe Islands under the updated roster of red countries and jurisdictions. Presidential spokesperson Harry Roque said in a statement that the new country risk classification lists, or the green, yellow, and red list approved by the Interagency Task Force for the Management of Emerging Infectious Diseases, will take effect from November 16 to 30. Following the IATF's directive, the Bureau of Immigration said travelers from Faroe Islands and the Netherlands are barred from entering the country from the said date, 16 to 30. On the other hand, Filipinos coming from these nations may be allowed entry as assisted by the government or non-government initiative repatriation flights or bayanihan flights.
Thousands of third-dose COVID vaccination appointments were booked on the first day they were available for the 5 City of Toronto-run immunization clinics. Here's Cherry Recolizado from our Canada Bureau. Cherry.
The third dose of COVID vaccine has come to the City of Toronto. After the Ontario Ministry of Health gave its green light to administer the third dose of the COVID vaccine, Toronto Public Health has opened vaccine clinics and has begun appointments online. Those who are eligible are the following members of the community: healthcare workers, essential caregivers, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis individuals, those who are 70 years old and above, and those who received 2 doses of AstraZeneca or Covishield vaccine. The city encourages these individuals to book and get their third dose if it's been 6 months since their last vaccine dose. As of this week, more than 8,000 third dose COVID vaccine appointments have been made. Toronto has opened 5 major immunization clinics, and they are at Cloverdale Mall, Metro Toronto Convention Centre, Mitchell Field Arena, Scarborough Town Centre, and Woodbine Mall. Toronto has also introduced the super supportive vaccine clinics this week. These clinics will support particularly those who have a fear of needles, those who may need a quiet space to get vaccinated, or those who may need an ASL interpreter. As of November 9, the City of Toronto has reported 58 new cases of COVID-19. 4 are hospitalized and 3 new deaths. About 2.3 million people in the City of Toronto are fully vaccinated. In Toronto, Cherry Recolizado, Eagle News. We live in interesting times.
And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba. Sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. Mailalabas natin ang aking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa New Era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Welcome back to the news. A draft statement of the COP26 summit called on nations to ease their reliance on fossil fuels as talks entered their final hours without any sign of delivering the emissions cuts needed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. COP26 President Alok Sharma warns that time is running short to clinch a deal before the summit's scheduled end on Friday evening. UN General or Secretary General Antonio Guterres says announcements made so far are far from enough to fight global warming. Take a look.
We are not there yet on the most critical issues. There is still a lot more work to be done. And COP26 is scheduled to close at the end of tomorrow. So time is running out. We still have a monumental challenge ahead of us. But collectively, we have no choice but to rise to that challenge and strain every sinew to achieve a timely outcome that we can all be proud of. Because ultimately, this outcome, whatever it is, will belong to all of us.
The announcements here in Glasgow are encouraging, but they are far from enough. The emissions gap remains a devastating threat. The finance and adaptation gap represent a glaring injustice for the developing world. We need even more ambition in future revised nationally determined contributions.
After 2 weeks of round-the-clock negotiations, delegates produced a roundup of their progress, which urged governments to accelerate the phase-out of unabated coal power and inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. Delegates in Glasgow from nearly 200 nations are charged with keeping the Paris Agreement temperature goals alive as climate-driven disasters hit countries the world over. The summit began with a bang as world leaders descended on Glasgow, armed with a string of headline announcements, from a commitment to slash methane emissions to plan to save the rainforests. But progress has stalled in the underlying technical and now minister-level negotiations. With 1 day left of scheduled talks, countries are hardly any closer to agreement over whether national emissions-cutting plans must be ramped up in the short term, how climate action is reported, and how vulnerable nations are supported.
Greater collaboration between the public and private sectors is vital to defeat the coronavirus disease, pandemic, and mitigate the impact of climate change. That, according to President Duterte during the Business Leaders Forum from the 21 member economies of APEC, or Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. During his participation in the 2021 APEC dialogue ABAC dialogue with economic leaders, President Duterte stressed the importance of promoting digital literacy to facilitate the inclusion of vulnerable groups in the digital economy. Let's listen in.
First, improving digitalization and literacy in rural communities. APEC's economies must strengthen cooperation in digital infrastructure development, especially in remote and disadvantaged areas. We must also promote digital literacy to facilitate the inclusion of vulnerable groups in the digital economy. This will help increase the economic productivity of marginalized groups under the new normal. Establishing a national social protection floor, or SPF. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the limitation of social protection programs in APEC communities. These gaps can be addressed through the SPF that guarantees a minimum set of social security benefits for all, in accordance with International Labor Organization standards. Third, facilitating the transition of developing economies to a low-carbon economy in face of the climate change. The Philippines reiterates its call for scaled-up, sustainable, and predictable support from developed countries. This should be in the form of climate finance, technology, transfer and development, and capacity building.
In other news, a 5.2 magnitude earthquake rocked southern Iceland on Thursday near the Hekla volcano, with tremors felt in the capital, Reykjavik, some 110 kilometers away. The country's meteorological office said that in an announcement. Now, the epicenter of the quake, which occurred at 1:21 p.m., was located at Vatnajökull, a mountain range located on a fissure zone near the larger Hekla volcano, which is part of the same volcanic system. The earthquake was felt widely in southern Iceland and the capital area, according to the Icelandic Meteorological Office in a statement. No damage or injuries were reported in the sparsely populated area, according to police. Geophysicist Paul Einarsson told public television RUV that the quake and its many aftershocks were not caused by magma movements and were not a sign of an impending volcanic eruption. At 1,491 meters, Hekla is one of Iceland's most active volcanoes, with its latest eruption dating back to 2000. Thursday's quake was most likely caused by plate motion and not volcanic deformation, according to Christine John's daughter, IMO Earthquake Hazards Coordinator, on Twitter. Now, a 5.7 tremor shook southwestern Ireland at the end of February, just weeks before a volcano began erupting near Mount Fagradalsfjall on March 19, 2021. After spewing lava for 6 months, the magma stopped flowing in mid-September, but it is still too early to say whether the volcanic activity has officially ended, according to volcanologists. Iceland is Europe's biggest and most active volcanic region.
To other news now, top Communist Party leaders wrapped up a key meeting in Beijing by passing an important resolution on the country's past, according to state media, which is expected to cement President Xi Jinping's grip on power. The Chinese Communist Party has passed a historical resolution cementing Xi Jinping's status in political history. The document, a summary of the party's 100-year history, addresses its key achievements and future directions. According to BBC, it is only the third of its kind since the founding of the party. The first was passed by Mao Zedong in 1945 and the second by Deng Xiaoping in 1981. It was passed on Thursday at a sixth plenary session, one of China's most important political meetings. As only the third Chinese leader to have issued such a resolution, the move aims to establish Mr. Xi as an equal to party founder Mao and his successor Deng. The four-day closed-door session gathered more than 370 full and alternate members of the party's 19th Central Committee, the country's top leadership.
The editor of a shuttered Singapore news website may face jail after being convicted on Friday of defaming government ministers over a letter published on the portal. The online Citizen, which was often critical of authorities, had long been in the government's crosshairs and finally had its license cancelled last month over a failure to declare funding sources. On Friday, Chief Editor Terry Zhu was convicted of defaming government members over the publication of a letter on the site stating there was corruption at the highest echelons, according to the court documents. Now, the 39-year-old, who will be sentenced next month, faces up to 2 years in jail and a fine for approving the publication in 2018. Prosecutors said the case was about whether people should be allowed to utilize online platforms as an insidious means to launch baseless and unsubstantiated attacks against other persons. Xu had argued during the trial that the letter was not referring to individual members of the cabinet. In September, he lost a defamation suit against Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong over an article carried by the site and was ordered to pay substantial damages.
To Europe now, pressure is building to address the plight of thousands of migrants, mainly Kurds from the Middle East, who are stuck at the Belarus-Poland border in freezing weather. The West accuses Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko of luring the migrants to Belarus to send them across the border in revenge for sanctions imposed last year after a heavy crackdown on the opposition. Belarus has in turn accused Poland of violating international norms by blocking the migrants and violently beating them back. Let's take a look.
Jest to też cicha zemsta Łukaszenki za to, że wspieraliśmy demokratyczne wybory ludzi na Białorusi z sierpnia zeszłego roku i te przemiany, które mieliśmy nadzieję, że nastąpią. Cała Europa miała nadzieję, że nastąpią.
Мы сегодня увеличили через Беларусь прокачку природного газа, заполнен Ямал-Европа. Мы обогреваем Европу, они нам угрожают еще, что они закроют границу. А если мы перекроем природный газ туда?
Russia said it will continue supplying gas to Europe after Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko threatened to cut off deliveries in response to possible sanctions over a migrant crisis on the Belarus-Poland border. Russia has been, is, and will remain a country that fulfills all obligations to provide European consumers with gas. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that to reporters. He also added that Lukashenko did not coordinate his statement with Moscow, which delivers gas through Belarus to Poland via the Yamal-Europe pipeline. For months, migrants have been trying to cross from Belarus to EU member Poland, but the crisis reached a new level when hundreds made a concerted effort this week and were pushed back by Polish border guards. Now, Western governments accuse Lukashenko's regime of luring them to his country and sending them to cross into Poland in retaliation for previous sanctions over Minsk's crackdown on the opposition in the wake of a presidential election last year.
In other news, the Myanmar junta court on Friday sentenced an American journalist to 11 years in prison on charges of unlawful association, incitement against the military, and breaching visa rules, according to his employer and lawyer. Danny Fenster, who had been working for local outlet Frontier Myanmar for around a year, was arrested in May as he tried to leave the country to see his family. He was sentenced to 11 years for incitement, unlawful association, and breaching visa rules, according to lawyer Zhao Ong. Fenster, who has been held in Yangon's insane prison since he was detained, also faces charges of sedition and terrorism, which could see him jailed for life. Tan Zhao Ong said the sentencing was based on evidence from the junta-appointed Information Ministry that showed at the time of his arrest, Fenster had been working at a local outlet, Myanmar Now, which had its license revoked shortly after the coup. The sentencing comes days after former U.S. diplomat and hostage negotiator Bill Richardson met junta chief Min Aung Hlaing in the capital, Naypyidaw. Richardson, declining to give further details, said the U.S. State Department asked him not to raise Fenster's case during his visit. Fenster is believed to have contracted COVID-19 during his detention, family members said during a conference call with American journalists in August.
OPEC lowered its world oil demand forecast for 2021 on Thursday, citing weaker demand in major consumers, China and India, and an expected hit from high energy prices. In a monthly report, the cartel of major oil producers cut its forecast by around 160,000 barrels per day. Global demand for 2021 is now forecast to reach 96.4 million barrels per day. Revisions were mainly to account for slower than anticipated demand from China and India in the third quarter, according to the report. OPEC's report said India's recovery was still challenged by lingering effects of the recent COVID-19 wave. OPEC experts expect world oil demand to rise to 106 million barrels per day 100.6 million barrels per day in 2022, 500,000 more barrels per day than before the pandemic hit in 2019.
Storied Japanese conglomerate Toshiba will split into 3 companies, it said on Friday, following a campaign by investors to boost the firm's shares after a period of enormous upheaval. The move is the first spin-off by a Japanese firm of Toshiba's size, and analysts said it could be a test case for other domestic conglomerates. The plan approved by the board will spin 2 companies off from the rest of Toshiba's operations within 2 years, one focused on infrastructure and the second on devices, with both eventually being listed. CEO Satoshi Tsunakawa said they have reached a conclusion that this strategic realignment is the best option. The plan must still be approved by shareholders, some of whom reportedly would have preferred a buyout, with a vote expected between April and June next year.
Eagle News will be back with more stories. Please don't go away.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Hi, I'm Alex Calleja, isang podcaster, YouTuber, writer, director, at isang stand-up comedian for more than 12 years. Kaya naman, heto na ang funniest nakawall videos! Ang natatanging show na bubusugin ang buong sambayanan sa katatawanan! Ito ang bagong tambayan ng buong pamilya at barkada. Mula Lunes hanggang Biyernes nyo kami makakasama tuwing 4:30 p.m. Dito lang sa Net 25. Dito, mapapanood natin ang best comedy videos na hinanap pa namin sa kasuluk-sulukan ng internet. So ano pang hinihintay nyo? Join na sa pinakabago at pinakamasayang afternoon habit ng tawanan at kulitan, ang funniest nakaball videos!
Welcome back to the news. Indigenous Veterans Day is observed in Canada November 8 in recognition of Indigenous contributions to military service, particularly in the First World War, Second World War, and the Korean War. For the details, here's Yolanda Espiras of our EBC Canada Bureau.
Earlier this week, Canada observed its National Indigenous Veterans Day. On this day, November 8, Canadians recognized the heroism of Indigenous veterans in helping protect the people of Canada for over 200 years. Established in Manitoba in 1994, this day became a National Memorial Day. Many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis served alongside Canadian veterans during the War of 1812, the two World Wars, and the Korean War. Many still continue to serve in other Canadian Forces actions to this day. Indigenous veterans brought with them remarkable skills to the military, especially those who had come from communities where hunting was necessary for survival. However, they faced and continue to face discrimination in the military, were denied benefits, and were not recognized for their service. In the past, Indigenous peoples were not recognized as citizens of Canada and were not conscripted into service. Therefore, all service they did was voluntary. Today, an approximate 3.5% of the armed forces are of Indigenous descent. Here in Toronto, flags flew half-mast at City Hall to recognize Indigenous Veterans Day. This significant day was also commemorated by the city through the installment of We Remember, an artwork created by Indigenous artist Jay Soul, also known as Chippy War, currently installed at Fort York. Canadians are continually encouraged to learn more about Indigenous veterans' contributions to Canadian history and to never forget the sacrifices they have made in the service of Canada, these lands, and its people. In Toronto, Yolanda Espiras, Eagle News. We live in interesting times.
And finally, in our news, a SpaceX capsule carrying 4 astronauts docked with the International Space Station, kicking off a 6-month stay on the orbiting post. Take a look.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks to all the SpaceX and NASA teams. As you mentioned, it was great to get to work on the vehicle, and I think we all loved the ride up there. It was way smoother than we could have imagined, and that feeling going from MECO to the second stage was just awesome, and a beautiful ride. It was neat.
Through the hatch is going to be NASA astronaut Kayla Barron. Some hugs there, and you can hear the claps inside Mission Control. Next up is European Space Agency astronaut Matthias Maurer.
3 is part of NASA's multi-billion-dollar partnership with Elon Musk's space company, signed after the space shuttle program ended in 2011 and aimed at restoring U.S. capacity to carry out human space flight rather than depend on Russia for links to the ISS. The ISS had been operating with just one NASA astronaut in the U.S. segment to welcome the incoming crew after the astronauts of the earlier Crew 2 mission splashed down in the Gulf of Mexico on Sunday. Crew 3's Raja Chari, Kyla Barron, and Tom Marshburn of the United States and Matthias Maurer of Germany traveled to space aboard a Crew Dragon capsule fixed to a Falcon 9 rocket from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. They blasted off late Wednesday. The spaceship, called Endurance, docked with the ISS around 7 p.m. Thursday local time. The quartet will spend 6 months on the orbital outpost and conduct research to help inform future deep space exploration and benefit life on Earth.
And that's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I am CJ Hero. See you back tomorrow.
And at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. We'll see you back tomorrow. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live in interesting times.
This program is supported by SMC Global Power,